First of all, before I introduce the formal sessions, again, just to draw attention to the fact that the weekend has been sponsored by the Department of the Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media, and the Decade of Centenaries Expert Advisory Group, Dublin City Council, and as you'll see from the brochure, the normal, and it is normal for us, fantastic no strings attached support from the trade union movement and indeed one or two commercial bodies here in the city. This session is going to have three speakers, and what I'm going to do, again, in order to save time, is to introduce the three speakers at the one time. Following on from Marcel van der Linden's great paper, which again, to remind you, is the first essay in Labour History and Irish History, the collection of essays, so you can study it, is on Labour Historiography. The first speaker standing behind me is Mike Mecham, whose wonderful biography of William Walker is still available outside, and I think we owe a lot to Mike from London for uncovering or recovering Walker and everything about him in that biography. Mike also serves on the National Committee of the Society for the Study of Labour History in Britain, so it's also nice that Mike represents a sort of fraternal link, sororal link with our sister society in the UK. Our second speaker, who's sitting over to my left, probably in more senses than spatially, I think, is Chris Loughlin, who lives in Lisbon, but has worked recently for the University of Manchester. And I've come across Chris, and he features in the collection of essays, but also in previous publications of Omiskin, looking at the labour movement in the north of Ireland and its attempts to deal with the divisive nature of sectarianism, civil rights, and so on. And our third speaker, who I'm particularly delighted to introduce, comes from Comparative in Brège, in Brittany, in France, Western France, teaches in the University of Caen, but has written, and again, an essay in Omiskin publications, and again in the current one, on workers' councils and Soviets in Ireland in the period of 17 to 23, and together with Sarah Ann Buckley and myself, we're editing a book of essays out next year on Ireland in the 1920s, Irish labour of the 1920s. So the format will be each of the speakers will come up one after the other. You'll see the details about them there, and then we're set up for a bit of a discussion afterwards. So, Mike Mecham.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Francis. And the thing is, with these lights, I can't see any of you. So apologies for that, because they're very hot as well. It's great to see the red carpet has been actually laid out for us this afternoon. The last time I saw something like that, Eric Clapton was playing on it. And I'm not sure whether that makes me hip or ancient. I think I know what it is. But thanks very much, Francis. And I'm very happy to bring fraternal greetings from the Labour History Societies in Britain, the one Francis mentioned, but also the Scottish and Welsh, which I'm involved with as well. So my involvement with the Irish Labour History Society means I have the full card. Francis is also allowing me a couple of minutes to mention the person that I dedicate my paper to, John W. Boyle. I think some of you may have known John, the late John W. Boyle. As you can see, that's what my paper is, but he was involved with the society from the beginning. And here he is with his wife, eminent historian as well, and their daughter Liz. And that's me, obviously, with Liz earlier this week over from Canada. In 2018, when I was doing the research on William Walker, Liz very kindly, I tracked her down, went through all her father's, late father's papers, and couriered all the papers relevant to Walker over to me, which was a huge help to my research. But what she's also done now is to pull all the rest of the papers out, and she gave me on Monday 9 kilograms of archive material. So I've managed to bring 4 kilos with me in my case. Some of them are here, and there's some real rarities and treasures. So I'm presenting those, or have done, to Jack McGinley for the archive of the Irish Labour History Society. So our great thanks to Liz and her family. When researching the life of Belfast Labour leader William Walker, and that's the book that Francie mentioned, which was published by Jack McGinley's Ummiskin Press in 2019, I was soon confronted with what became known as the Connolly Walker controversy, a rather intemperate public debate in 1911 over how best socialism could be achieved in Ireland, an eternal question almost, really. It helped in many ways to define Walker in Irish Labour history as an inconsequential figure compared to the iconic James Connolly. Connolly's early biographer, Desmond Greaves, set the tone when portraying the debate as highlighting Walker's inadequacies as an unworthy opponent of Connolly. There was no common ground between them, Greaves said. End of story, perhaps. Until Professor Alvin Jackson, an eminent Irish historian, now at the University of Edinburgh, sent me his foreword to the Walker book. He said that while it was Connolly's crystalline idealism that had prevailed amongst historians, neither was without his complexity. Perhaps a future generation of Irish progressive, he said, may not have to choose between them, but instead be able to accept the best of the legacies of each. Perhaps the time was right, therefore, to liberate Connolly and Walker from their respective political and historical silos. The question was how to open up such a space. One possibility was through the well-established genre of the comparative or dual biography. A good example was Alvin Jackson's own 2019 study of those other great protagonists, John Redmond and Edward Carson. While they were from opposing political parties, Connolly and Walker, those socialists of different hues, were from the same movement, two sides of the same coin, if you like. The question I address at the head of my paper. Could there be common ground between them? What were the things they shared rather than dividing them? British Labour leader, the founder, really, of the British Labour Party, James Keir Hardie, he saw it. He supported both of them, Connolly by helping him with funding to launch Workers' Republic, and Walker during his parliamentary contests in North Belfast. The same coin, as far as Keir Hardie was concerned, was the emancipation of the working class. So what I have to offer today, therefore, are some ideas, some speculative thoughts, if you like, on a Connolly Walker comparative biography. In the time available, I can only hope to offer perhaps an outline or a structure for such a project. So this is broadly how I will proceed. I should perhaps start with briefly summarising what the Connolly Walker controversy was. There you go. Oh, I can see it there. It took place in the Glasgow Socialist newspaper Forward in the spring-summer of 1911, a time when both constitutional and industrial crises were unfolding. Connolly opened by asserting that Irish Home Rule was a certainty and urging the Labour movement to come together and plan for that movement, essentially under the aegis, I think, of the Socialist Party of Ireland. But he didn't help his case by spending the rest of the article chastising the Belfast labour movement, and particularly its leader, William Walker, for its obstructionism and opposing Home Rule. He in fact welcomed Walker's defeat in the recent Edinburgh-Leith parliamentary election. It also reflected in some ways Connolly's long-held exasperation with the passivity of the Belfast working class. As he saw it, he had called them willing slaves at one point. His language could be patronising and somewhat high-handed in the brandishing of his own internationalism and Marxism. Yet he was undoubtedly a leading figure in Marxist thinking, and I've spent the summer reading the 1,000 pages that comprise the complete works, which it doesn't, of James Connolly, and they are a really interesting and good read. Walker took it personally, both for himself and his Belfast comrades, and the exchanges between them increasingly personalised on both sides. The editor called a halt. Over 6 issues, they revealed their divergent approaches to socialism, revolutionary or parliamentary, debating internationalism, the Belfast parochialism, Protestant contribution to Irish revolutions, municipal socialism, and so on. But Home Rule did not directly reappear again during the debate, while underscoring it, I think. Walker doesn't mention it. That may have reflected his own sense of the inevitable. He had called for the abolition of the House of Lords, the last real obstacle to Irish Home Rule. But Walker felt that his lifetime's work in Belfast, often unrewarding and dangerous, was being unfairly denigrated by someone whose own commitments in Ireland, to him, had appeared to be fitful. Nor was Connolly seen by Belfast Labourists, even those supporting him, as a sympathetic comrade. Many thought him too inflexible, and giving the impression that nobody knew anything till he came. Others said, of course, similar things about Walker. So against that background, how might we approach a comparative biography of Walker and Connolly? Here are some elements, though more, I think, could be added. Firstly, family life. One would compare their family lives. Where did they come from? How do they compare? What sacrifices did their families make, and the women in their lives in particular? Education. They were both working class autodidacts, educated while working, essentially through the labour movement. The nurturing of a socialist. Why were both of them drawn to socialism? What were their roles and influences? Were some of them shared? Personality. How much of their personalities shaped their approaches to politics and their relationship? Were they just too much alike? Compromise or rigidity? To what extent were they compromisers? Were they flexible in their approaches or just too rigid? Road to socialism. Were their roads as rigid or revolutionary or parliamentary as one might imagine? The governance of Ireland, complete independence, or part of the British labour movement? Place of religion, which the President mentioned earlier in the day. How did each respond to the challenges of the church, clerical interference, and opposition to socialism? I will consider that particular issue in more length shortly. Women in society. To what extent did each challenge the oppressed place of women in society and call for improved rights? I will also look at that in more detail. So how did their lives compare and contrast? They were born within 2 years of each other and died within 2 years of each other at the same age of 47. Both were from working class backgrounds. Connolly in Edinburgh to Catholic Irish immigrants, and Walker to Protestants in Belfast of Scots descent. But Connolly's circumstances were of extreme poverty, while Walker's could be described as the labour aristocracy of Belfast. He was apprenticed in the Harland and Wolff shipyards. Connolly had to work from the age of 10 or 11, while Walker was schooled until apprenticed, aged 15. Connolly spent 13 of his 47 years in Ireland, Walker the whole of his life. Connolly was drawn to socialism around 1890, Walker 1892. Connolly from what he experienced and from what he witnessed. As I said, both were autodidacts, largely self-taught through the labour movement. Both suffered family tragedies. Connolly, the loss of a child, Walker, the loss of his parents by the age of 15, and his wife when 36. Both had similar personalities. They were robust and driven, intense, intellectually arrogant. They did not suffer fools and sometimes held grudges. The first thing I will look at, therefore, is religion. It's been argued that Ireland is an exception to Eric Hobsbawm's rule that modern working class movements have developed with an overwhelmingly secular, often anti-religious ideology. Certainly both Connolly and Walker were acutely aware of the need for caution when propagating socialism, acknowledging that an anti-religious stance could have political consequences. Arguably, Connolly was more cautious. He acknowledged his Catholicism while privately expressing skepticism. However, that did not prevent him from having fierce disputes with the clergy. He saw how, with a devout working class, was still prepared to defy the clerical exhortations on political and labour issues. For him, the role of the church was simply spiritual, not interference in social and political issues, especially when it sided with the forces of capitalism against the working class. His most definitive statement was in his 1910 pamphlet, Labour, Nationality and Religion, in which he carefully and sometimes ferociously challenged the pretensions of the clergy in attacking socialism. Then in 1913, despite his own reservations about the scheme, he challenged Archbishop Walsh's opposition to the Lockout Children's Relief Scheme, saying that it was the duty of the church to oppose those causing the suffering. Yet in 1908, he castigated the, quotes, atheism of some irresponsible advocates of socialism. It was possible, he said, to be an active Catholic and militant socialist, adding, somewhat surprisingly, that the Catholic Church always accepts the established order, even when previously opposed to it. All the Protestants, he asserted, were Orangemen. Only those going to the Catholic Church became rebels. Well, William Walker was certainly not an Orangeman, and in 1912 he did not sign the Protestant Ulster Covenant, which vowed to oppose Irish Home Rule by any means. As I said earlier, he had already called for the abolition of the House of Lords, the last real obstacle to Home Rule. Unlike Connolly, Walker did not adhere to the Protestantism of his birth. He was agnostic. His census returns showed that he was agnostic, and he declared himself to be an agnostic. Indeed, he pushed against clerical interference. As he told Connolly during the controversy exchanges, "Against clericalism I am, and I've said as much more about the Protestant than the Catholic clergy." He particularly opposed clerical interference in education, but also as an elected poor law guardian. He told the Belfast Trades Council education needed to be freed, and I quote, from political wire pullers and vested interests to ensure that it was absolutely free from all denominational control. Yet, like Connolly, he couldn't go too far, conceding that the church would be justified in opposing him if he were an atheist. My own research led me to conclude that his moral compass was, however, guided by Christian ethics. Through the Christian socialism of James Keir Hardie and the commitment of his older sister, Lizzie, who I will mention later. She was a devout Christian, an admired nurse in the Belfast Poor Law Infirmary, and died for her beliefs as a nurse working in Africa. My second focus is on the rights of women. Two quotes. The first from Walker in 1893 in a pamphlet I discovered. Women workers have to be treated more humanely. Poverty and hand-to-mouth That's Walker's pamphlet. In the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the labour movements in Britain and Ireland were marked by male supremacy. The craft unions were particularly backward with protectionist practices that excluded women. Indeed, trade unionists had mixed opinions, a lot of them seeing women workers as cheap labour, as potential blacklegs, and as undercutting wages. Yet Walker, here in 1893, persuaded his Carpenters' Craft Union to levy its members to provide funding for the Women's and then in Workers' Union. Not long after, in 1896, Connolly included in the programme for the nascent Irish Republican Socialist Party a commitment to free maintenance of children and universal suffrage, which received huge support from Eleanor Marx, who I will mention at the end as well. These commitments from both men threaded through their social and political activism, as well as their writings for the rest of their lives. Connolly's hand could be seen in the proclamation of the Republic with the guarantees of religious and civil liberties and equal rights for all citizens. But his most comprehensive and powerful statement was in the chapter on women in the Reconquest of Ireland, published in 1915, which I quoted from earlier. Walker was also on the executive committee of the British Labour Party for the 1910 general election and signed its programme, which pledged the sweeping away of restrictions upon the franchise, including, I quote them, the sex bar. He stood as the Labour candidate in Leith, Scotland, and his election address spelled out more fully his commitment that women should have equal rights with men to the fullest extent, and that he would do all in his power to achieve that while securing full adult suffrage. Their commitments were not just from political idealism. They were from their own experiences, within their own experiences, within their own families. In comparing the lives of the two leaders, it would be essential to look at the women in their lives, the heavy burdens carried by their wives, which in Walker's case might have led to the tragic early death of his first wife, and also the influence such women had on their direction. In Walker's case, as I mentioned, the devout Christianity of his older sister, Lizzie. And Connolly's case, the active American communist activist Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was mentioned earlier on in the conference. But I will end with a question I always set before starting Why should we look? It's best summed up for me by Rachel Holmes in her superb biography of Eleanor Marx, the politician, thinker, feminist, and activist. Karl Marx was her father. Holmes says, to live with Eleanor for a while is to have an opportunity to remember how we got here, where the democratic liberties we enjoy came from, and at what price we let them go. To my mind, this resonates with what you say, Francie, at the end of your 50th anniversary lecture, where you say, contemporary workers urgently need to create a new history. While the past is inherited, the future can be changed. There is no inevitability. Thank you. I just put this book up. It's the latest book on Connolly. There are hundreds of books come out, but it is an interesting one, and I've reviewed it for Scottish Labour History, so that will be coming out later in the year. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to take questions at the end, so Chris Loughlin.
I'll just clear my... It's the green one. The green button.
Okay, thanks very much for allowing me to speak and for taking part in the conference. It's a great pleasure to kind of be here, but down from the Black North, down with all of you today. There we go, I'm not on my own apparently. Somebody shouted out from the crowd, thank you, I'm not on my own. Anyway, today what I'm going to speak to you about is about expanding labour. I'm going to talk about the Irish New Wave and the New Global History. I didn't quite realise it would be a homage to Marcel van der Linden, who's in the room at the moment, but it probably will be in that kind of sense. But hopefully it'll kind of lay out some of the bases of the work and what Marcel was saying in his very interesting opening remarks for the conference as well. So, on to what we're going to look at today. Today, what I'm going to talk to you about is about research about labour history that I've been conducting over the past number of years, and about the expansions of labour and class that have occurred over the past 50 years, but especially in the last 10 years in the Irish context as well. And really one of the aspects about this work to think about is that what I'm really trying to work towards and thinking about is about the philosophy of labour history itself, about what the significance of class is in history, in the broadest perspectives possible, which is exactly what Marcel van der Linden and the new global labour historians have been trying to do, and other authors such as Jacques Rancière have also tried to do as well. And by thinking about such as the term proletariat, that term itself is an ancient word originally, and that's then being used and updated in modernity. But what I'm going to talk to you about in the paper today then is start by thinking about so long to class, problems in the history of class and labour, the crisis of class as it was known. I'll then move on to talk about defining the working class and how Marx defined it and why that left open questions for labour historians, for the left as a whole. And then I'll talk to you about the expansions that have gone on in a number of different areas, especially about class with the new global labour history itself, but also with ethnicity and race, with critical race theory, intersectionality and whiteness studies, and then about gender and sex with social reproduction theory and worker feminism, and last, just touch on the political Marxism of Ellen Meakson's Wood. And then the final section, I'll then talk about that and show and point out some of the areas where this is impacting Irish studies and Irish labour history, wider Irish history as well, or what I call the Irish New Wave is the way to think about this. So long to class. Well, the political defeats and neoliberalism itself, the implication of neoliberalism politically, culturally, socially, all led to a widespread kind of disillusionment in broad terms with the idea of class, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. The organised working class, the traditional working class, was questioned at this period. And that organised working class, really we mean that trade unions and labour parties, was questioned in the kind of cultural turn by certain labour historians, such as Gareth Stedman-Jones. Hobsbawm, for example, in a very famous lecture, talks about the forward march of labour halted and about how the social bases of labour politics have been undermined by the crises in the 1970s and 1980s, and questioned that ability for labour to win politically, electorally into the future. And Gortz really questioned, because of neoliberalism and because of those new production methods that contributors were talking about in the last session as well, because of those neoliberal economic changes that were going on, saw that as the end of that traditional working class. However, we now realise, and a lot of critics, a lot of contemporary cultural theorists have all seen how overblown and hyperbolic those kind of ideas about the death of class and the crisis of class actually were. That class critique that Marx pioneered and that's been so influential in lots of areas remains and still is exceptionally relevant in that 21st century that, again, contributors were talking about as well. A number of authors also tried to talk about going beyond Marx in the 1980s and 1990s. The post-Marxists, for example, would have seen culture and different social subjects as being important, as new bases for radical left and democratic politics, probably most famously in Leclau and Mouffe's book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy from 1985. You also have the analytical Marxists of Cohen and Romer, for example, who tried to refound Marxism as they saw it, and really refound Marxism on the basis of a productive force or a technologically determinist Marxism as well. And that's where Ellen Mixon Wood's work comes in here, and the political Marxists comes in, because they would have rejected that idea of technology determining, of material conditions determining. It's politics that they would have seen as the central point. Politics is the place where class struggle is actually fought out within. And I just couldn't help but bring in Fukuyama there as well, because he was that exemplar of that neoliberal evangelical triumphalism, which really dominated, like the first political memories I have is from that period of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet bloc as well. But so what is the working class? Well, the definition that Marx was working with was a doubly free wage worker, but usually class and labour have been associated as being male, industrial, moneyed and free labour as well, and that it's taking place in public and that it's moneyed in that sense. For Marx, as I said, it's a doubly free wage worker. What do we mean by they are doubly free? We mean that they're free to sell their labour power on a market, and that they're also free from access to or ownership of the means of production as well. And as I said, that's part of the, or as it says on the slide there, that's part of machinofacture, the industrial working class, and that tends to be male, public waged and worked. Marcel van der Linden has recently, or stated about 5-6 years ago, quote, traditional labour history very much focused on certain groups of workers, industrial workers, dock workers, miners, sometimes agricultural workers, especially wage earners, and it had a very institutional approach. It focused mainly on strikes, parties, unions, and resolutions. In a previous publication of that, Roth and van der Linden together had outlined areas where Marx's critique could be seriously questioned, such as first, that capitalism has lasted longer than Marx ever envisaged. Second, that Marx studied capital and capitalism, and that he didn't study the labourer or the working class as a whole. Third, that Marx had a fetishism of objectivism and science. And fourth, that he privileged that doubly free wage worker. And last, that Marx privileged the nation state and was Eurocentric as well. Now, the new global labour historians have responded to that by talking about how you can expand class and expand what we mean by labour, and that essentially and especially it needs to expand past that doubly free wage worker conception. And to then quote from Roth and van der Linden again, because it sums up and is, shows what we mean by this expansion of labour history. Quote, "The new approach is that we broaden the notion of the working class so that we include also slaves, sharecroppers, and the labour of the people who make this whole working class possible. This includes housewives and all those who do unpaid work for the maintenance of families and the household." So if you're back at home this evening or tomorrow and somebody is making your dinner, you can go, well, there's a working class person, there's class right in front of you going on. Van der Linden and Roth go on that we not only need to study many more forms of organisational initiatives, i.e. all kinds of self-help, cooperatives, mutual aid societies, attempts like self-employed women's organisations in India and South Africa, but we also try to expand the notion of the working class so much that we include non-European parts of the world as well, where we can only recently speak of a huge expansion of the traditional working classes, which had been the focus of the old labour history. So there's the key kind of class expansion or labour expansion of labour history there as well. But those kind of ideas about expanding labour, and sorry, I'll just go back there because that expansion, you can see about female service, non-monetary forced labour, indentured labour, slavery, prison. We can see how you can expand then labour history from being something that's usually associated with modernity into something that is going back to the early modern period, such as Lindbach and Rediker have written about as well, but also back into areas of such as the medieval period and right back into the ancient world as well. So ethnicity and race has been expanded in the past period as well through critical race theory, which has centralized and seen race as a central category of social and economic emancipation. You have intersectionality, which is also trying to look at power, domination, class, race and ethnicity together. And both of those two fields have been very important in shaping the kind of nascent field of what has been called whiteness studies as well. Now, many years ago, or about 5-6 years ago, I read that Rediker and Lindbach book called The Many-Headed Hydra, which is about the early modern period and where class kind of emerges, how the working class emerges in this early modern period before the factory, before manufacture. And the quote that he uses, and they continually talk about in the first chapter, is this very, very famous quote, which for Northerners has a particular resonance, which is, quote, "the hewers of wood and the drawers of water." Now, if you read any Irish history in the 17th or 18th, from the 17th or 18th century, you will know that that phrase is the definitive phrase that is used continually to exclude Catholics in Ireland from being within the Constitution, but it's used throughout the early modern period in the Atlantic world for lots of different people that are excluded, including African slaves as well. And it comes from the biblical curse on the Gibeonites, is where it actually refers to, because they were the ones that would be those hewers of wood and drawers of water. And I remember reading that phrase and kind of realizing, whoa, okay, so that early modern period about labour history, that actually those exceptionalities, those questions of Protestantism, of sectarianism in Ireland are integral to where class and modernity is emerging out from as well. D.R. Rudiger is the probably most famous exemplar of this wages of whiteness and this idea of a whiteness studies. But that idea of the wages of whiteness has recently been being applied and being used in British context by Robbie Cillian, who's done a very important book called Race and the Undeserving Poor, where he draws together the links between how racial minorities are treated in the British Empire and how the poor are then constructed in the 19th and 20th centuries in Britain itself. So there's one area, or another area where it's expanded in ethnicity and race. On gender and sex, we also have further expansions as well going on too. So to quote from Federici's work on this, she says, quote, "The persecution of witches, like the slave trade and enclosures, was a central aspect of the accumulation and formation of the modern proletariat in Europe as well as in the world. Further, she sought to transcend the dichotomy of class and gender. Quote, she says, gender should not be considered a purely cultural reality, but should be treated as a specification of class relations. And alongside that, you then have social reproduction theory as well, whose fundamental insight is that human labour is at the heart of creating or reproducing society as a whole. And the social reproduction theory expands the notion of economy to include domestic life, family, community, and social reproduction. And second, it treats questions of oppression not as at the margins of analysis, but as central points of that critical economic process that's going on. So in sex and gender, we have very important expansions as well that are complementary to those expansions about class that are being talked about. And Lisa Vogel and Bhattacharya are two of the major writers and theoreticians about this as well. Last, the political Marxism of Brenner, Wood, and the two Woods as well, has also seen an expansion of labour in terms of applying labour conceptions, class conceptions, to thinking about intellectual history especially. It's one of the really interesting aspects I find about Ellen Meekson's Wood's work especially, is about that intellectual history about labour. They rejected a stagist view of history and say that an explanatory primacy in history should be accorded to the relations of production. The separation of the political and the economic is unique to capitalism. Most other societies, previous historical societies, have had some form of mixture between public politics that's going on and also the economy together. And the economy being privatized or being private and being divorced from political power in that sense is a unique capitalist development of these ideas. So, before I go on to that Irish New Wave, all I can say to you at this stage about the paper that I presented to you as well is I can't go further in depth into these ideas, but this work is based upon a 20,000 word manuscript I have at the moment that I'm working on that looks at more of the ideas about digital labour, effective labour, all the new forms of kind of labour that neoliberalism has thrown up as well. The key thing to think about, though, is that idea that labour is expanded both theoretically and empirically by these new global labour historians and by allied and complementary developments in other areas as well. So class, labour, and Irish history. Well, the last 10 years have seen new approaches to Irish history and society developing. There's a fifth wave of Irish labour historiography has developed. And Conor McCabe and Emmett O'Connor put it in 2010. They said that recently labour history has embarked in Ireland on a fifth wave, characterised by an ambition to integrate labour with kindred studies in gender, race and culture, and by a greater emphasis on transnational comparison and on labour as a globalised concept. This could plug Irish labour history into the forefront of new thinking and see it make a quantum leap from the third to the fifth wave. And oh my goodness, I love that. I remember as a child watching Quantum Leap all the time. So any chance I get to use that phrase, thank you, Emmett O'Connor and Conor McCabe for using that phrase about a quantum leap. That work of the historians of the Labour History Society in the 1970s and of pioneers in this field from the 1980s and 1990s has been developed by other historians and by new ideas, by people like Adrian Grant, Brian Hanley, Fergal McFlotsky as well. And they've looked at strikes, disputes and revolutions and thinking about the role of labour and Irish labour history within that. Material cultures of class and Irish material cultures and what they represent, such as about clothing. There's great research being done in University of Ulster about clothing and the working class in Ireland, for example. And the last person to kind of note to you is Gerard Madden's work on anti-communism in Ireland, which is really significant and interesting work as well. On the right of the slide there, you can see Michael Pearce's book from 2017, A History of Irish Working Class Writing. So there's really interesting stuff about navvies in that book by Michael Pearce. I think there's 2 chapters that are about the navvies and their experience and the literary expression of the of navvies' understandings. However, A key area where Irish labour history has expanded is in women's history. So the collective bibliography at the moment stands on Irish women's history at 1,400 items, is how much it stands at. And there's really important work about domestic life, marriage and work. Professor Daly's research about women and work in Ireland, for example, a recent edited collection by Elaine Farrell at Queen's, who jointly edited about women and work in Ireland from 1850 to 1950, and then textbooks on class and women as well. Professors Luddy and O'Dowd have recently just finished the definitive work about the history of marriage in Ireland from 1600 onwards and about abductions. Sarah Campbell, Helga Wogan, Linda Walker have all produced very important research and work about the life of working class women and biographies and labour histories about these as well. The study of the Irish Revolution has also developed new areas as well in terms of the social, transnational and global perspectives about the Irish Revolution. And the social interpretations are really associated with Hart Coleman and McGarry, but you have really fascinating developments about ethnicity also going on at the moment as well, especially in that slide or that book by Fergal McGarry, or jointly edited about global histories or global revolutions. The political theory of the Irish Revolution is currently being investigated by Peter Bourke and Mark Mulholland as well, and there's really fascinating ideas about that as well. However, in the women's history that we have, there's really brilliant research that's being conducted, but masculinity and gender history is far less kind of developed. Sarah Ann Buckley will be talking about this with you tomorrow. We're talking at the conference tomorrow about this as well, so I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say about this. Brady and McGackie are two of the historians who've begun to look at the ideas of and develop these ideas about masculinity and thinking about class and masculinity as well. The last term I would talk about with you or raise with you is this idea about counter-revolution. So something that's really understudied in the Irish context, and this applies in Ireland but also internationally, is the idea of counter-revolution and what it really means and how working class people have been involved in that and with what significance as well. And I think that's where those ideas about sectarianism and racism would also come into this as well. And there's also an idea about the Irish Revolution, but that's really under-theorized comparatively. What do we mean by the Irish Revolution in comparison to, say, the French Revolution, etc., etc.? And because the last thing I would say to you about that counter-revolution is about the Vendée of the Irish Revolution is the North. Because the Vendée is a pro-royalist uprising in the western department of France against the French Revolution. And obviously, or what happens is that the Vendée is defeated in France, but the Vendée, if we draw an analogy in Ireland, wasn't defeated in Ireland. The Vendée established an actual state. The last point to highlight to you is that idea about hauntological and necrotic perspectives or death perspectives about Irish working class history, because that has just recently developed as well with work by Jonathan Evershed, for example, about this, and Michael Pearce has also worked on it too. And so what do we mean by that Irish New Wave? Is that quantum leap from the third to the fifth wave of Irish labour history, where labour and class are being combined with gender, race and culture, and transnational and global comparisons are also being drawn through and are also being developed out as well. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Maintenant, notre frère français, Olivier Coquelin.
All right, thank you, Francis, for this word in French. First, let me say how honored and moved I am to be here in such a prestigious place as Liberty Hall. The 100 or so experiences of workers' self-management that swept across Ireland in 1918-23, almost all under the name of Soviets, came into existence in a time of political, social, and economic turmoil in Europe. Ireland herself was experiencing a major political revolution led by Sinn Féin and the IRA to achieve independence. However, as Emmett O'Connor points out, referring to the inspiration for the Irish workers' direct action, quote, a common explanation has been that the exploits of the IRA and the achievements of Sinn Féin provided the stimulus. However, the effect of this was not to provoke, but to enable workers to take action. More likely, the real inspiration was provided by contemporary events in Europe: the Russian Revolution, the factory occupation in Italy, the industrial unrest in Britain and Germany, and most of all by the way the victorious allies turned the old world upside down in 1919, shaping a new Europe simply because they had the will and the power to do so, unquote. If credence is given to the latter assumption, the Irish Soviets would have been in the wake of an international rather than a national subversive movement. So this paper will present the European Soviets and Workers' Councils so as to divide them into sets based on how closely they adhered to the Russian model. This will enable us eventually to determine the set in which Ireland could fall into. However, due to lack of time, I'm going to concentrate exclusively on continental Europe, thus setting aside Britain, and develop somewhat only the Ukrainian case and skim over the other countries. But before doing so, it is of course necessary to provide an overview of the so-called Irish Soviets. As you know, the revolutionary years saw many social disputes, both industrial and agrarian, gradually spreading across Ireland from 1917 onwards. And when strikes, negotiations, and other methods specific to the agricultural sector failed to obtain full satisfaction of the demands, some workers resorted to Soviet occupation. This mode of action was, of course, named after the Russian councils, which had arisen during the 1917 revolution. And it rested on workers taking over the production and management in a democratic way, but not without first ousting or ignoring the official owners and manager. The self-management practices within these Soviets made them genuine subversive experiments comparable to the Russian factory committees through which workers had taken control of production in their workplaces. This, therefore, distinguished them from the Soviets, properly speaking, which were more focused on political issues. But in contrast to the Russian factory committees, the Irish Soviets also emerged in areas other than industrial and for purposes other than socio-economic. This was the case in the agricultural sector and in various services such as hospital, port and transport, as well as in a number of urban areas where the workers organized in Soviets pursued not socio-economic but socio-political aims, as in Limerick in April 1919 and in many Irish towns outside Ulster for 2 days in April 1920. The latter Soviets were therefore more akin to Russian Soviets, strictly speaking. However, as Donald O'Driscoll points out, quote, in all cases of Soviets up to 1921, the employer's property was returned once demands had been met, unquote. This means that the Soviets were not intending to go beyond the tactics of struggle, which were based on the workers themselves running and managing production, thus enabling them to demonstrate that their demands were valid and could be successfully put into practice. This was essentially the way Irish Soviets operated, at least until 1921, as a means of pressuring employers or political authorities to give in to the strikers' demand. The major difference with the Soviets of 1922-23 was that the latter were set up not to obtain wage increases and improve working conditions, but to fight against the wage cuts that employers and farmers wanted to impose following the slump that began in mid-1920. And this intensified class struggle, leading this time to the total defeat of the striking workers. But while for most of the protagonists of the Soviets, the aim was not to promote a socialist revolution, at least not for the time being, many of them did not hesitate to display socialist subversive symbols, starting with the term Soviet, which some spontaneously gave themselves, but also the red flag hoisted on many of the occupied workplaces, or openly anti-capitalist slogans such as "We make bread, not profits," printed on the front door of the brewery factory in 1921, a famous picture of which can be seen here. So, as I said in my introduction, I'm going to use the Russian model as a comparative common thread. And in doing so, I will begin with the particular case of Ukraine. Particular in that, paradoxically, it was Lenin's government that drew its inspiration, to a certain extent, from an ideological model that was not Bolshevik, but libertarian, communist or anarcho-communist as regards its agricultural policy in Ukraine in 1918-20. So, as you know, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire when the revolution of February 1917 broke out. In June of the same year, Ukraine proclaimed its autonomy, followed by full independence in November. In the meantime, revolutionary activists such as Lenin and Trotsky had returned from exile, while others had been released from prison, such as the Ukrainian anarchist Nestor Makhno, who was to play a major role in the events that followed. Back in his hometown of Huliapol, Makhno resumed his militant activities and quickly became a major figure in the local revolutionary movement. A peasant himself, Makhno encouraged poor peasants to form free communes on the large estates confiscated from local landowners from autumn 1917. Aware that not everyone in the peasantry shared his collectivist approach to agricultural work, he also advocated a fair redistribution of land based on the principle that land should belong to those who work on it. However, including the former landowners, if they so wished. However, this is here a picture of Nestor Makhno wearing his famous Cossack uniform. However, following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Ukraine officially came under Austro-German control in March 1918. Makhno then organized resistance to the occupation by the Austro-German armies. Nevertheless, he had to leave Ukraine, and in the course of his wanderings, he met Lenin in Moscow on the 25th of June, 1918. So during this meeting, the two men notably talked about the free agricultural communes of Ukraine, Makhno telling Lenin that almost all of them had been created by anarcho-communists. This undoubtedly struck a chord with Lenin, as a week later, the Council of People's Commissars released 10 million rubles in aid to the communes. And so, Bolshevik support for the creation of agricultural communes in summer 1918 increased the number from 242 in June to 1,384 in December. These communes operated on the principle of solidarity, equality, and self-management, and comprised between 100 and 300 individuals. Decisions were taken democratically at the General Assembly, where everyone could express their opinions. The land was worked collectively, cooking and dining facilities were shared, and education for children and parents was also provided. as we saw earlier, Ireland also experienced this kind of collective self-management practice in the agricultural sector, in this case undertaken by farmers who had benefited little or not at all from the 1903 and 1909 Land Acts. Unlike the Ukrainian communards, however, their main aim was to improve the distribution of land or drastically reduce rents rather than to collectivize the land, strictly speaking. And this was particularly true in the village of Bradford, County Clare, where in February 1922, tenant farmers seized the estate of their landlord, James Dennison Going, in order to obtain a full satisfaction of their demands. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to go into detail, in relation to the Bradford Soviet in order to save time. So, like the other Irish Soviets, the protagonists of the Bradford Soviet sought to demonstrate that their demands were valid and could be successfully put into practice. In other words, there was no question of overthrowing the socio-economic order on the Bolshevik basis, for example, in the form of a cooperative farm, and even less on an anarcho-communist basis as in Ukraine. And so in Ukraine, things began to change from 1919 onwards, when the agricultural communes were gradually abandoned by both the Makhnovists and the Bolsheviks. The main reason for this was that the small and medium-sized landowners in the villages took a dim view of these communes run by poor peasants. And so, in order not to lose the support of this section of the peasantry in this time of civil war, the Makhnovists and then the Bolsheviks began to encourage the fair redistribution of land rather than its collectivization. Thereafter, the communes would survive as best they could throughout the 1920s before disappearing for good in 1935 to the benefit of kolkhozes and sovkhozes. So I'm going to skip, the fate of Makhno and his army in order to save time. So we will now briefly look at the European countries that were more or less inspired by the Bolshevik model, where it was applied on a greater or lesser scale and for a longer or shorter period. Starting with Hungary, which had a council regime throughout its territory for 7 months in 1919. This, therefore, makes it a far cry from the Soviet experience in Ireland. As you know, the end of the Great War saw the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, giving rise to a republic in Hungary in November 1918. However, the coalition in power, comprising independentists and social democrats, had great difficulty in handling the various social unrest affecting the country at the time, notably through the creation of workers' councils, which took control of many factories and businesses and of several provincial towns. Faced with an ultimatum from the Entente countries, the war victors, so, concerning Hungary's new borders, the government preferred to resign, leaving the way clear for Belakon's communists, increasingly popular with the population, to seize power with the Social Democrats and proclaim the Hungarian Republic of Councils on the 21st of March 1919. However, this council regime, which officially established the dictatorship of the proletariat and nationalized the means of production, only lasted for a few months and came to an end on the 1st of August 1919 as a result of a combination of external and internal factors that I won't mention, I'm sorry, due to lack of time. So this is here, you can see here a picture of Belakon, who was the communist leader of the Hungarian Republic of Councils. So, I'm going to skip all this, sorry about that. It was also during the period of the Hungarian Soviet regime that two other countries in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire were to experience a Soviet upheaval. As in Slovakia, incorporated into Czechoslovakia in October 1918, where a Republic of Councils was proclaimed on the 16th of June 1919, following the invasion of part of the country by the Hungarian Red Army with a view to reestablishing Hungary's former borders. But this short-lived Slovak Republic of Councils, created mainly by Hungarian communists, was not to survive the demise of its Hungarian counterpart on the 1st of August 1919. So here is a map, of the Slovak and Hungarian Council republics, in which you can note that only parts of Slovakia was under communist rule. The other main component of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, that is Austria, also saw the development of workers' councils in factories in most cities following the establishment of the Republic of German Austria on the 12th of November 1918. However, under the influence of the ruling Social Democratic Party and after the failed putsch attempt by the Viennese communists in June 1919, these councils were stripped of their political contempt and gradually transformed into co-management bodies that didn't challenge the foundations of the capitalist system. This was actually, in line with the strategy of slow revolution as theorized by the social democratic leader Otto Bauer. So here you can see a photo of the repression of the attempted communist putsch in Vienna, which took place on the 5th of June 1919. The other Central Empire, the German Empire, actually underwent a more or less similar fate after the war with the establishment of the so-called Weimar Republic on the 9th of November 1918, following the creation of workers' and soldiers' councils, which gradually spread throughout the country. Here too, however, these councils were to lose their political substance under the influence of the ruling social democrats who controlled most of them. The gradual advent of socialism that the social democrats were calling for even led them to suppress the Spartacist uprising of January 1919, as a result of which the workers' and soldiers' councils set up in November 1918 were also forcibly dismantled. The same was true of the Bavarian Republic of Councils proclaimed by Social Democrats on the 7th of April 1919, but after a few days led in a revolutionary fashion by communists until it was finally crushed on the 3rd of May by the far-right militia, the Freikorps, used by the Social Democratic government to wipe out the country's workers' and soldiers' councils. So here we have a photo of the Reich Congress of Workers and Soldiers' Councils held in the Prussian, Landtag, in the Prussian, in Berlin, on the 16th of December 1918. In this respect, it is also worth mentioning, the other territory of the former German Empire, which experienced a council revolution, that is Alsace-Lorraine, at least before officially, returning to its original French bosom. In fact, from the 9th to the 25th of November 1918, that is during the transitional period, Alsatian and Lorraine sailors from the German army and local workers took over 24 urban areas in Alsace-Lorraine, including Strasbourg, and set up workers' and soldiers' councils to manage day-to-day affairs such as transports, finance, and food supplies in place of the official authorities. A bit like what the Limerick Soviets would do a few months later in April 1919. But the arrival of French troops finally put an end to the short-lived council revolution in Alsace-Lorraine. So here we have a map of the council, the workers' councils set up in Alsace-Lorraine for 2 weeks in November 1918. Finally, one last continental European country that saw the development of the council movement was Italy during the so-called Biennio Rosso, that is the 2 red years of 1919-1920. This period actually took place against a backdrop of economic and political crises in the wake of the Great War and was marked by many industrial and agricultural disputes. And when conventional strikes were not enough, workers resorted to factory occupation in the industrialized north, many of which were transformed into workers' councils that took over the running of production, as also happened in Ireland from late 1918 onwards, more specifically for the industrial Soviets from mid-1920. This was the case at the Fiat factories in Turin, where in September 1920, delegates were elected to coordinate production, while others were elected for the defense of the plants through armed workers' militias known as the Red Guards. The Fiat Factory Council also announced that it wanted to establish trade relations with Soviet Russia and sell cars there. The immediate revolutionary aims of the workers' councils were therefore quite clear, which distinguished them from the Irish Soviets, at least in this respect. However, many in the leadership of the Italian Socialist Party and the country's main trade union, the General Confederation of Labour, were opposed to extending the movement to the rest of the country. The CGL, therefore, preferred to negotiate an agreement with the employers whereby the factories would be evacuated peacefully in exchange for the wage increases demanded and the promise of workers' control over the management of the companies, a promise which was actually never kept. This agreement eventually sounded the death knell of the Italian council movement, in that, left on their own and disillusioned, the striking workers had no choice but to return the factories they had occupied and managed. Here too, the majority of socialist and trade union leaders had a reformist vision whereby the advent of socialism could only be achieved gradually. But this reformist vision conflicted with the aims of a section of the rank and file, has happened in Ireland too, at least to a certain extent, especially in 1922-23, when class struggle escalated. So here you can see a picture of Red Guards posing outside a Turin factory in September 9th, 1920. So, in conclusion, it can be said that the Irish Soviets were indeed parts of a European subversive movement, more or less inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1917 and Bolshevism, with the exception of Ukraine, at least to a certain extent. While there were some disparities between each country, these movements nonetheless shared a number of common features. For example, it seems possible to include Ireland and Italy in the same subset, the two cases being quite similar in many respects. For other countries, on the other hand, what they had in common was inter alia that their respective conservative counter-offensives led in the shorter or longer term to the establishment of fascist or fascistic regimes, as in Hungary, Italy, Germany, and Austria. The question we can now ask ourselves is, what were the reasons that prevented the advent of a socialist revolution in post-First World War Europe, where the situation was clearly revolutionary? Of course, I won't have time here to list all the possible reasons, so I'll just mention one of them. Thus, for example, we can ask ourselves whether the dichotomy between socialism from below and socialism from above, of which the Irish and the other European Council movements were in a way victims, if I may say so, and which is characterized not by the opposition between reform and revolution, but between a vision of socialism originating from the rank and file and a vision imposed by a ruling elite, whether reformist or revolutionary. So whether this dichotomy was not a major factor in the failure of the European-wide socialist revolution that the Russian Bolsheviks were calling for. Thank you very much for your attention.
So if anybody wants to ask a question, can you indicate it, please? Chap down here at the front, another one there. We'll take those two. Can you keep the questions as succinct as you can? Have we got a roving mic there? I think the roving mic is coming. Thank you very much. We'll take the lad at the back there. He's nearer to you, the guy with the glasses. Just put your hand up again to indicate. And can you please give your name when you ask a question?
My name is Patrick Smiley. I'm another tourist from the north, but I can't claim any black associations. If you don't mind, I've got three questions, one for each speaker, and I'll try to make them succinct.
Quick as you can.
So, firstly, Mike, were you being a bit selective when suggesting that Walker didn't sign the Ulster Covenant in 1912, I think, when his career was essentially over, his political career, but he did infamously signed a deeply sectarian document in 1907 during the North Belfast election. There were three of those, and he was sectarian in all three. Just trying to make a comparison with the idea that whilst he didn't sign the Ulster Covenant, he did sign a deeply sectarian and problematic document in 1907 when he was at the peak of his political career and ambition.
I might have to confine you to that, Pat, because we really are very, very short of time. John Martin, do you want to ask a very quick question? Yeah. Just speak up.
Yeah. Well, what comes to my mind is that it was never expected by Marx or by Lenin that a revolution, a workers' revolution, would actually take place in Russia or the other countries that we have been just shown. Marx's strategy was that the working class revolution...
Brief question, please.
Well, as I said, was Marx right in saying that it had to be the industrial areas like Britain and Germany where they had the trade union movement, they had the apparatus...
I'm going to take that as the question, really, because we have no time. It's a good question. And when I ask Mike, Olivier and Chris to come back to it, just to thank the comrade here and his friend for doing all the sound today. Can you show them a round of appreciation, please? So the first question was selective that Walker, okay, he didn't sign the covenant, but he signed the sectarian document in 1907.
Well, he didn't actually sign the document in 1907. Yeah. It was a questionnaire that was put to all the candidates, including the unionist candidate, who was rather more clever than Walker. And he did not, he escaped the questionnaire. I wasn't trying to be selective, I must admit. That was 1907. And a lot of the questions, you're quite right, can be interpreted as sectarian. Bob Purdy looked at it in some detail and raised a lot of questions as to whether they were as sectarian as they appear. And it was published in Northern Whig, I think. As regards comparing it with 1911 and 1912, 4 or 5 years later, Walker, I think, my impression, my feeling is Walker had actually changed. His position in 1907 was that he wanted to win a unionist seat for Labour. And I think he was tactical in that. Error-ridden, it may well be, looked at historically. But what he was trying to do was to persuade, it was said that he lost the election because of that questionnaire, i.e. the Catholic workers did not vote for him. I'm not sure the evidence is there for that, to be perfectly honest. I'd love to talk further about it, but I think I'm being shut up on that.
Time is against us. Olivier, do you want to take the question of... I know, no, we've got the next speakers at the back of the hall. Oh, right. Was Marx right in saying that the revolution would only happen in industrialized states?
Yes, in Britain, in Britain first provided, I mean, after a while he realized that Britain could not achieve a socialist revolution before it had, you know, got rid of the Irish question. That's the reason why, you know, as you know, this part of history encouraged Irish autonomy or independence. Yeah, but I mean, in Germany that was a failure, of course, and it was a failure in Britain as well. I mean, just after the First World War. Yeah. Yeah.
Lenin wrote 2 years before the Russian Revolution, and at his age, he would never see a revolution in his lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is, there was a strategy there from the International and the Second International that for the working class revolution to be successful, it had to take place in the industrial areas of Europe on the basis that it had this trade union movement, it had this...
Okay, John, you've made the point. You've made the point. You've made it very eloquently. Okay, I think we really have run out of time. We're getting signals at the back, so I'm just going to wrap this up. It's unfortunate we don't have a lot of time, but we are hopefully most of us here for the weekend. I was just thinking as the papers unfolded that they dovetailed neatly into Marcel's opening session, and just the value of historiography in terms of sometimes having theoretical models or theory giving you questions you can ask of your material is maybe something that generally we've overlooked in Irish Labour history. So the three papers were excellent. I also thought of poor old Rainer Lycett, who would have loved to have been here to take half an hour to ask his question on the Soviets, but God bless him wherever he may be. So can you please show your appreciation to Mike Mecham, Chris Loughlin, and Olivier Coquelin. And we're now going to invite Kevin Murphy to come up to the stage for the next paper from John Cunningham. Thank you all.